"We come to serve you," the girls said. And Rancher let them stay. Jacob Whitaker lived on a ranch far from the nearest town.
It was a place where the land stretched out as far as the eye could see, and the only sounds were the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional call of birds overhead. Jacob had always loved it that way. The quiet life was all he had known since he had inherited the ranch from his father. It was hard work, but it was honest work. Jacob did the same things, feeding the cattle, fixing fences, and making sure the land was well taken care of. But lately the days felt longer than they ever had before. The loneliness had started to creep in. His father had passed away years ago, and since then, Jacob had kept to himself. He didn't mind working alone, he was used to it. But now, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the work that weighed on him. It was the silence. There were no neighbors nearby, no friends to talk to, no family, just him and the land. Some nights, as he lay in bed, he wondered if there would ever be anything more to life than the routine he had built. One afternoon, when the sun hung high in the sky and the air was still, Jacob was out in the field mending a broken fence. His old horse stood nearby, patiently grazing on the grass as he worked with the tools he had used for years. The ranch was big, and it seemed like there was always something that needed fixing. It wasn't the kind of place you could leave for long, not without the risk of things falling apart. As Jacob bent down to tie a piece of wire, he noticed a figure in the distance. At first he thought it was just a trick of the heat rising from the earth. But as the figure drew closer, he saw it was two women walking towards him. They didn't look like anyone from the nearby town. There was no sign of a carriage or horses. They were simply walking, their boots kicking up dust as they made their way toward the ranch. Jacob stood up, wiping his brow, unsure of who they were.
As they got closer, the first woman, who looked to be in her early 20s, spoke. "Good afternoon, sir.
We were wondering if we could ask a favor." Jacob eyed them carefully.
He wasn't used to strangers showing up out of nowhere. "What brings you out here?" he asked, his voice cautious.
The second woman, a little older and with a kind face, spoke next.
"We've been traveling for a while, and we were hoping to find somewhere to stay for a short time."
"We can help with the work. We've done farm work before." Jacob hesitated. He wasn't sure what to make of them. He hadn't had company in months, and now two women were showing up at his ranch asking for a place to stay. There was something about their eyes that made him wonder, though. They didn't seem like trouble, but he still had to be careful. People who were down on their luck didn't always show their true colors right away.
"And what exactly do you mean by help?" Jacob asked, trying to figure out their intentions. He had been burned by people in the past. There was always the risk of someone taking advantage of a kind offer. "We can cook, clean, and help with whatever needs doing," the older woman said, her voice steady and calm. "We don't have much, but we've been walking for days and we could really use a roof over our heads for a little while." Jacob glanced at the sky, considering their request. It wasn't as if he had a crowd of visitors every day. The ranch was far from the beaten path, and most people who passed by didn't stop. He didn't want to turn them away, but he also wasn't sure if it was wise to let strangers into his home. "We're not looking for charity, sir," the younger woman added, as if sensing his doubt.
"We only ask for a place to rest and a chance to work." Jacob felt a tug of sympathy. The ranch was always in need of extra hands, and these women seemed like they genuinely wanted to help. Still, he had learned not to trust too easily. He looked at them both closely, trying to gauge their sincerity.
"All right," he said finally, his decision made. "You can stay for a while. But you'll need to work. There's always something to do around here."
The women smiled, their eyes lighting up in relief.
They looked at each other briefly, as if silently communicating, before the older one spoke again.
Thank you, sir. You won't regret it.
Brask. Jacob wasn't so sure about that, but he didn't feel like he had a choice. The thought of a little extra help didn't sound so bad, and maybe their presence would fill some of the emptiness he had been feeling.
After all, it wasn't as though there were any other options. He had the room, and it would be good to have some company, even if it was temporary.
"Follow me," Jacob said, leading them towards the ranch house. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the land.
As the women walked behind him, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something unexpected. The two women, Alice and May, followed Jacob into the house. They didn't ask many questions as they settled into the small cabin he called home. It was modest with just a few rooms, but it had everything they needed. Jacob showed them to the guest room where they could sleep, and told them where the kitchen was, so they could prepare a meal. He had a large pantry, stocked with food he had grown and preserved himself, but he didn't mind sharing it with them, Pace. They had been kind enough to offer their help, after all. As the evening wore on, Jacob found himself sitting at the small wooden table, watching the two women as they prepared a simple meal. It was strange, having company in the house. The silence that usually filled the room was now broken by the sound of them talking quietly to each other, their voices soft and gentle. It was a comfort he hadn't realized he had been missing. The loneliness that had settled into his bones seemed to lift just a little. After dinner, Jacob excused himself to his room, but before he closed the door, he turned to the women.
"I'll get up early tomorrow. There's plenty of work to do, if you're ready for it."
We'll be ready, Alice said, her smile warm and genuine.
With that, Jacob closed the door and lay down on his bed.
As he stared at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder about the women.
There was something about them that felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but it made him curious. Why had they come to his ranch of all places? What was their story? For now, he didn't have the answers. But he had a feeling he would soon. The next morning, Jacob woke up early as usual. The rooster had crowed long before the sun began to rise, and the quiet of the ranch had always been his alarm clock. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long hours of work the day before. But today was different. The quiet seemed different, too. There was a new presence in the house, and it wasn't just the two women who had come to stay. Jacob had always been a man of routine. He liked things in order, knowing what to expect from each day. But with Alice and May around, there was a sense of change, a change that brought with it a new energy. It wasn't just about the work getting done. It was something deeper, something more alive. Breath. As he made his way to the kitchen, he noticed that Alice was already there, preparing breakfast. She was moving with ease, frying eggs and bacon, the smell filling the room with a warmth that made Jacob's stomach rumble. He wasn't used to someone else making breakfast for him, but he liked it. It felt good.
"Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," Alice said, turning to him with a smile.
Her hair was tied back in a neat braid, and she had a calmness about her that Jacob found comforting. "Morning," he replied, taking a seat at the table. He noticed May was sitting across from Alice, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the cooking process with an almost curious expression on her face. She hadn't said much the day before, and her quiet nature intrigued Jacob. There was something about her that seemed reserved, but not in a cold way. It was more as if she was trying to keep something hidden, something she wasn't ready to share.
"Everything's looking good," Jacob said, trying to start a conversation. Alice nodded, her smile growing wider.
"We wanted to make sure you had a good meal before starting the day." Jacob couldn't help but notice how easily they fell into a rhythm. They didn't ask for much. They didn't take anything without offering something in return. Their presence felt natural, as though they had always been part of the ranch. Fast. May finally spoke up, her voice soft but steady.
Thank you for letting us stay here.
We didn't expect anyone to be so kind to us. Jacob looked at her, surprised by her sincerity. He hadn't expected such gratitude. Most people he had helped in the past never seemed to appreciate it, and he had learned not to expect anything in return. But these women were different. There was no hidden agenda in their words, no false smiles or empty promises. They truly seemed thankful. You don't have to thank me, Jacob replied. You're working, and that's enough. It's what I need out here. May nodded, but there was still something behind her eyes. A sadness, maybe? He couldn't quite place it, but he wasn't going to push. He had learned the hard way that some things were better left unsaid.
After breakfast, the three of them went outside to start their day's work.
Jacob showed Alice and May the areas that needed attention. The broken fence at the northern end of the ranch, the barn that needed some repairs, and the fields that had to be tended to before the winter frost set in. He wasn't sure what they were capable of, but he had to admit, they seemed eager. There was a quiet determination in the way they moved, as though they were used to hard work. Rask. Alice took the lead on the fence, her hands steady as she tied up the wire, while May followed Jacob to the barn. She was quiet but efficient, sweeping the floor and organizing the tools with careful hands. Jacob noticed she had a kind of grace to her movements, like she was in tune with the space around her. It was nothing like the clumsy way he had seen others work before. The day passed quickly. By midday, the chores were almost done, and Jacob found himself feeling more relaxed than he had in a long time. The ranch seemed livelier, even though it was just the three of them. There was something about working together that made the time fly, and before Jacob knew it, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. As they gathered in the kitchen that evening, the warmth of the fire crackling in the stove, Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the strange turn of events. He had never expected things to unfold this way. But he had never expected company, and certainly not this kind of company. Yet as he sat down to dinner, he realized that something had changed in him. The loneliness, which had always been a constant companion, was starting to fade. Alice and May were eating in silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that made Jacob feel like he wasn't alone anymore. They had become a part of the rhythm of his life, and it felt natural. After dinner, Jacob walked outside for a moment of peace. The sky was clear, the stars beginning to appear one by one as the darkness settled over the ranch. He leaned against the porch railing, breathing in the crisp evening air. Breath. It had been a long time since he had taken a moment just to appreciate the quiet, but now it felt different. The stillness was no longer overwhelming. It felt comforting, like the beginning of something new. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see May walking up to him, her face a little softer than it had been earlier. "Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you again for letting us stay here."
Jacob nodded.
"Like I said, it's no trouble. You're helping me, too." May hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "We didn't have many options before we came here. I
not sure where we would have gone. Jacob studied her, sensing there was more to her story.
But instead of pressing, he just gave her a reassuring smile. "Well, you're here now. And you're welcome to stay for as long as you need."
May's eyes softened, and for the first time Jacob saw a small flicker of relief in them. It was as though she had been carrying a heavy weight, and for a moment it had been lifted.
She didn't say anything more, but her gratitude was clear. The evening went on quietly, and as the night grew colder, Jacob realized something. He had offered them a place to stay, thinking it would be a simple arrangement. But now, it felt like much more. He had opened the door to something new, something unexpected, and in doing so had found a sense of connection he hadn't realized he was missing. By the time the stars were bright above, Jacob went inside to find Alice and May already preparing for bed. The house was still, but there was a new warmth in the air, and Jacob found that he was no longer alone in the way he had been before. It wasn't just the work or the routine that had changed. It was the presence of these two women, who had come out of nowhere and yet had already made a home for themselves in his life.
The ranch felt different now, and Jacob couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold.
He had no idea where Alice and May had come from, or what their pasts held. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was just waiting for something to happen. He was living it. The days passed by quickly, and the ranch seemed to come alive in ways Jacob hadn't expected. The work was getting done faster than ever before, with Alice and May helping out in ways Jacob hadn't thought possible. They didn't just do the chores. They made everything feel more organized, more efficient, and, somehow, more peaceful. The silence that had once filled the house now felt like a comfortable kind of quiet. Their presence had brought a warmth to the ranch that Jacob hadn't realized it was missing. Every morning, they would wake up early. Alice would take care of the animals while May worked inside cleaning and cooking. There was a rhythm to it now. A rhythm that Jacob had never thought he needed but was slowly growing fond of. Each task seemed to fit perfectly into place. Jacob found himself looking forward to the small moments, the shared meals, the occasional quiet conversations, and the small smiles exchanged between them. It wasn't just the work that had changed. Something deeper was shifting. Jacob wasn't sure what it was, but there was a bond beginning to form between him and these two women. A bond that felt unspoken, but real. He still didn't know much about their past, and he didn't push them to share. Alice and May were both private people, and Jacob respected that. He had learned over the years that some things were better left alone. But little by little he began to see more of who they were. Afternoon after a long day of work, Jacob sat on the porch with a glass of water, enjoying the cool breeze that had finally come in. He watched as Alice fed the chickens, her movements swift and sure, and May sat on a nearby rock, staring out at the horizon. The ranch had been quiet for so long, and now, with the two women around, it felt more alive, more like a home. May, Jacob called, noticing that she hadn't been as active as usual. She looked up, her eyes soft but distant. "You okay?" She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice low. Jacob raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press. He had learned to read people over the years, and he could tell there was something she wasn't saying. But again, he wasn't one to force someone to talk. He had always believed that people needed their space to open up, and if May wanted to share, she would. Alice walked over and sat beside May. "We're just about done for the day, right?" she said, trying to shift the conversation. Jacob nodded. "Just the last few things left for tomorrow." "We'll finish up after breakfast." The silence settled between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like a gentle understanding, a space where each of them could exist without needing to fill the air with words. Jacob found that he didn't mind it. He liked the quiet company. It wasn't often that he had someone to share the work with, and now that he did, he realized how much he had missed it. As the sun began to set, Jacob stood up, stretching his arms above his head. The long days of labor had made his muscles sore, but it was a good kind of tired. "I'll go check on the horses before dinner," he said, grabbing his jacket. "I'll come with you," Alice said, standing up.
The pasture's getting a bit overgrown again. Maybe we should cut the grass tomorrow. Jacob didn't object.
"Sounds good." May stayed where she was, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Jacob felt a tug of curiosity. There was something about May that seemed different from Alice. While Alice was open, practical, and always ready to pitch in, May was more reserved, more thoughtful.
It wasn't that she was unkind, she just kept to herself more. The two of them walked out to the pasture, the air growing cooler as the sun dipped lower.
The sound of the horses grazing filled the air, and Jacob took a deep breath, appreciating the peacefulness of the moment.
"You think May is all right?" Alice asked, breaking the silence.
Brasp. Jacob glanced over at her, surprised by the question.
What do you mean?
She's been quiet lately, Alice said. I know she's usually quiet, but it's different. She doesn't really talk to anyone anymore.
Jacob thought for a moment before responding.
She's been through a lot, Alice. I think she's just carrying things in her own way.
Don't worry about her too much. If she wants to talk, she'll talk.
Alice nodded, but there was concern in her eyes.
I just wish she'd open up. It's like she's holding something back. I don't know what happened to her, but I can tell it's not easy for her.
Jacob knew that feeling well. Sometimes people carried their burdens so deep inside that it took years for them to feel safe enough to let anyone else see. He had seen it before in others who had come to the ranch looking for solace, looking for a place to heal. She'll come around, Jacob said, though he wasn't entirely sure.
Everyone heals in their own time.
The rest of the evening passed without much event. The horses were fed, the barn checked, and Jacob and Alice sat down to a simple meal.
May joined them later, sitting quietly at the table. The tension between her and Alice was palpable, but May didn't bring it up. She simply ate, her eyes lowered, her thoughts clearly elsewhere.
Jacob didn't push the subject.
He had learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be forced. Later that night, after dinner was cleaned up and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Jacob found himself sitting on the porch once again. The stars above were bright, filling the sky with their cold light. It was peaceful, but there was still a nagging feeling in his chest, something that told him there was more to this story than he understood. Faye's past was something she hadn't shared, and Jacob had a feeling it was a pain too deep to put into words. But there was something else, a sense of protection, of running, that he had seen in her eyes. Birth. He had lived long enough to recognize when someone was trying to hide from their past, and May was trying hard to do just that. Jacob didn't know what had happened to her before she came to the ranch, and maybe it wasn't his place to ask, but he couldn't help but feel that the women had come here for more than just a place to stay. They were seeking something else, something that Jacob wasn't sure he could give them. But for now, all he could do was offer them a roof over their heads and a chance at a fresh start. He would be patient. He would wait. And when the time was right, when May was ready, she would tell him what had happened. Until then, he had his ranch, his work, and the two women who had changed everything. The days on the ranch continued, and Jacob found himself more at ease with the new routine. Alice and May had become a part of the landscape of his life, as familiar as the morning fog or the distant mountains. They worked hard every day, and the chores around the ranch got done faster and with more care than Jacob had ever managed on his own. It was hard to imagine how things had been before they arrived. So quiet, so solitary. Now the ranch felt alive in ways it hadn't in years. But despite the smooth flow of the days, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. There was a restlessness in the air, something that wasn't quite right. It wasn't the work. It wasn't even the presence of Alice and May. It was something deeper. The tension was especially strong that afternoon when Jacob noticed men riding toward the ranch. They were on horseback, dust rising from the ground as they approached. Jacob squinted into the sunlight, his heart starting to race. It wasn't the usual kind of visitor. These men didn't look like travelers. They looked like trouble.
Alice and May were in the barn tending to the animals. Jacob didn't want to worry them unnecessarily, so he took a few steps forward to get a better look at the riders. As they neared, he saw that they were rough-looking men, their faces hard and worn from life on the road. There were 4 of them, and they didn't appear to be in any particular hurry. They rode slowly, as if they were expecting the ranch to be there when they arrived. Jacob turned to walk back to the house. His heart was beating faster now, and he felt a strange knot in his stomach. These men weren't coming for a friendly chat. He knew it. He had seen enough in his life to recognize the signs of trouble when they came. When he reached the porch, he stopped for a moment, taking a breath. He didn't know who these men were or why they were here, but he wasn't about to let them intimidate him. The ranch was his, and no one was going to take that away from him. He turned to see Alice and May walking toward him, the men in the distance still approaching. "Alice, May," Jacob said, his voice low, "stay inside."
I don't want you getting involved with this. They looked at him, but there was no fear in their eyes, just concern.
Alice spoke first. "Who are they?"
Jacob paused, watching the men ride closer.
"I'm not sure."
"But I think it's best if you stay inside, just in case." He didn't need to say more. The girls knew something was off.
May's face was tense, and Alice looked like she wanted to argue.
But she nodded, and without a word, they both walked back into the house. Jacob stood there, waiting, watching, as the men rode up to the fence. They stopped, and one of them, a tall man with a scruffy beard, dismounted his horse and walked toward Jacob. The others stayed mounted, watching from a distance. Jacob didn't move, just stood firm, his hands at his sides.
"Evening," the man said, his voice rough. "Hey, you the owner of this place?"
"I am," Jacob replied.
"What can I do for you?" The man looked him up and down, sizing him up.
"Bration. We're looking for a couple of women. A pair of runaways, if you will."
They came through here a few weeks ago. You seen them?"
Jacob's mind raced. He knew exactly who they were talking about. Alice and May. He had no idea who these men were, but he could guess that their intentions weren't good.
I don't know what you're talking about,
Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man raised an eyebrow.
"Don't play dumb with me."
We know they came through here. We just want to have a little chat with them.
Jacob stepped forward, standing tall in front of the man.
"I said I haven't seen anyone. And if you're looking for trouble, you'll have to go elsewhere. This ranch is private, and I'm not letting anyone onto my land without a good reason."
The man's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, old man. Those girls owe us." "Just step aside." Jacob could feel the anger building in him, but he kept it under control. He wasn't afraid of these men. Not with his ranch at stake. Not with Alice and May depending on him.
"I'm not letting you take anyone."
"Bah. You turn around and you leave now, or we're going to have a problem."
The man grinned, showing yellow teeth.
"So be it." Before Jacob could react, the other men dismounted and one of them reached for a rope. The tension in the air was thick now. Jacob could hear the sound of the horses' hooves on the dry ground, the wind whipping through the trees. His mind raced, but he wasn't going to back down.
"Not now." Just then a voice called out from behind him.
It was May. She had come outside and her voice was clear and firm.
"You can't have us," she said.
Jacob turned to see her standing on the porch, Alice beside her. The two women stood together, their faces serious.
Jacob's heart skipped a beat.
He hadn't expected them to come out, but now that they were here, he felt a strange sense of relief. The women weren't afraid. They were standing their ground. The tall man turned to face May, his eyes narrowing. "You've got some nerve showing yourself. You've got no idea what you're getting into."
"We know exactly what we're getting into," Alice said, her voice calm but fierce.
"And we're not going anywhere with you." The man took a step forward, but before he could reach them, Jacob stepped in front of the women. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're not welcome here, and if you don't leave now, I'll make sure you regret it." The men looked at each other, clearly weighing their options.
For a moment, Jacob thought they might back down, but the leader's eyes were hard. "You've made a mistake, old man," he said again, but this time there was less confidence in his voice. Without another word, the men mounted their horses and turned away. The leader shot them one last glare before they rode off into the distance, disappearing into the fading light of the day.
Jacob watched him leave, his heart still pounding in his chest. As the last of the men disappeared from view, he felt a mix of relief and confusion. He didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't coming back without a fight.
He turned to Alice and May, who had stayed by his side.
There was no fear in their eyes now, just gratitude and something else, a sense of safety, of having someone who would protect them. Jacob felt a deep sense of pride in what he had done. He had stood up to those men, not just for himself, but for the two women who had come into his life in ways he hadn't expected. They had become more than just guests. Brown in desperation now.
"You're safe here," Jacob said, his voice softer than before.
"And no one's taking you anywhere." May smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in days. Alice nodded, her eyes meeting Jacob's with unspoken thanks.
For the first time since they had arrived, Jacob felt like he truly understood the importance of the choice he had made. He hadn't just taken them in for the work they could do. He had given them a home, a place where they could be safe, and he realized that, in doing so, he had found something more for himself, too.
The following weeks passed peacefully, but a strange feeling of unease lingered in the air. The men who had come looking for Alice and May never returned, and Jacob was glad for that.
The ranch returned to its usual rhythm, just the quiet clatter of hooves on the dirt, the clink of tools, and the steady hum of work that had always filled the air. But even with the peace, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It wasn't a bad feeling, just an awareness that life on the ranch had turned a corner. It wasn't just his ranch anymore. It had become a home, a place where stories, untold and hidden, were waiting to unfold.
Alice and May had become a part of the daily life on the ranch.
They worked hard, taking on different tasks each day, and their presence had changed Jacob. The solitude that he had grown used to had faded, replaced with laughter over dinner, quiet conversations in the evenings, and the sound of footsteps in every room. He had never thought he needed anyone else, but now he realized how much he had longed for this kind of connection.
It wasn't just about having help with the chores. It was about having people around to share the silence with, to break it up with stories, and to give the days meaning.
The bond between Jacob, Alice, and May had grown stronger, though Jacob still felt there was something they weren't telling him. It wasn't that they were secretive. It was more like they had their own silent understanding, a shared history that neither of them was ready to speak about.
Jacob respected that.
He wasn't the type to push someone to open up before they were ready. But sometimes, he caught them looking at each other in a way that told him there was much more to their past than he had been told. By a bond forged in something heavier than just coincidence. But what it was, he wasn't sure. One evening, as Jacob sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alice came to sit beside him, breathfully. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with possibility. Jacob had gotten used to the quiet of the ranch, but tonight the silence felt like it was leading up to something, like something was about to break the calm. Alice sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak at first, just watched the horizon, her expression thoughtful, breaking. "You've been quiet lately," Jacob finally said, breaking the silence. He glanced over at her, curious. "Everything all right?" Alice didn't look at him right away. She just stared at the setting sun, the fading light casting a soft glow across her face. After a moment she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "It's just... sometimes I think about where we were before," she said, her voice trailing off. "Before we came here, I think about how we had nowhere to go, how we were just running." Jacob didn't interrupt, but he could feel the weight of her words. He had known that they were running from something. He just didn't know what. The past they kept hidden seemed to weigh on them, even now. But Jacob didn't press her for details. He understood that some things couldn't be forced out into the open. "I don't blame you for not telling me," he said, his voice gentle. "Everyone has their own story. I'm just glad you're here now, you and May. You've given this place more than I thought possible." Alice looked over at him then, her eyes warm. "We're glad, too. You have done more for us than we ever expected." "You didn't have to take us in. You didn't even know us." Jacob shrugged, trying to downplay the emotion that stirred in him.
Sometimes you don't need to know someone to help them.
"It's just the right thing to do." Alice smiled faintly. "That's true." She paused for a moment, considering her next words. "But I think May's ready to talk. She's been thinking about it for a while." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Bo. May had always been the quiet one, the one who seemed like she carried more than she let on. Jacob had been waiting for the day when she might finally open up, but he hadn't pushed. If she was ready now, he was willing to listen.
What does she want to talk about? Jacob asked, his voice low.
Alice hesitated before answering. "She wants to tell you what happened. She doesn't want to keep it hidden anymore." Jacob nodded, feeling a quiet sense of anticipation settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what May's story was, but he was ready to hear it, even if it was painful. He had come to care about both of them, and he knew that the truth, whatever it was, would bring them all closer. A few hours later, as the stars began to shine brightly in the dark sky, Jacob found May sitting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her face was soft, her eyes distant as she gazed out into the night. Jacob walked over to her, his steps slow but steady. "May," he said gently, "Alice said you were ready to talk." May looked up at him, her expression guarded but not afraid. For a long moment she said nothing, as if deciding whether or not to speak. Finally, she set her cup down beside her and looked directly at Jacob. "It's not a pretty story," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need to tell it. I don't want to keep running from it anymore." Jacob sat down beside her, his heart heavy with the weight of what she might say. He didn't interrupt, just let her find the words in her own time. "I grew up in a town much like this one," May began, her voice quiet but steady. "It was small, quiet. But it wasn't safe for me."
Not after after I lost my parents.
I didn't have anyone to turn to, and things started getting worse. There were men who took advantage of people like me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I ran. Jacob felt a pang of sorrow for her. But he said nothing. He had known that they were running from something, but now the details were beginning to form. He could see the pain in May's eyes, the deep scars that her past had left on her.
We ended up on the road for months, May continued.
We didn't have much. We just kept moving, hoping for something better.
We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we had to keep going. Jacob could hear the quiet pain in her words, and his heart went out to her. "You're safe here, May," he said gently, his voice soft. "You don't have to go anywhere. You have a home now." May nodded slowly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know. And I'm grateful."
I'm grateful to you, Jacob, for giving us a place when no one else would.
There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, a moment where words didn't need to be spoken for the bond between them to be felt. Jacob had never asked them to tell him their story, but he was glad they had.
He was glad that they were no longer carrying their past alone. "We'll be okay here," May said, her voice stronger now.
"I'm not running anymore." Jacob smiled softly. "No, you're not. You're home." The quiet of the night settled around them, and Jacob felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just about the ranch. It was about the people in his life, the people who had come to stay and made a home in his heart. He didn't need to know every detail of their pasts, but he understood that the future was what mattered now. They had all found something here, something more than just a place to stay. They had found family, and that was more than Jacob had ever expected when he had first opened his door to the two strangers.
As the night deepened, the stars above shining bright and clear, Jacob realized that life on the ranch had become something new.
It wasn't just a place of solitude and work anymore. It was a home, one filled with people who had found each other through their struggles, their fears, and their hopes for a better tomorrow.